Happy now? But you're here, Jane. What do you want to record it for? You want to hear it twice? Do you? Yeah. Is it? You know, the worst thing is, when you hear yourself speaking on a recording, it just sounds so bizarre. You go, is that me? I sound awful, so I never listen to it. No way. I'd rather die first. Oh, good.
Because when you listen to the person in real life, after like, why are you slow?
Me slow, that's the first.
No, that's the thing. Like, you hear it, you're listening to you on a recording. It's like, oh, screw that shit up.
Right, last bit of mycology. Two groups today. The first group are the hyaline fungi. So these are hyaline, septate, but not dermatophytes. So these are all going to be susceptible to cyclohexamide, and they don't cause cutaneous disease anyway, so they're not susceptible to dermatophytes. And the zygomycetes, big group. They form zygospores sexually, but asexually they form sporangia and sporangiospores. So even though they're called zygomycetes, that's a sexual connotation to them. They form sporangia and sporangiospores, big, broad hyphae, fast growers. And all these bugs in these two groups have one thing in common: they're all really common in the environment, but they cause horrible diseases if you're unlucky. So this also applies to bacteria as well as to fungi, but it was, for a long time, this sense that there were bugs in two groups: those that cause disease, the pathogens, and those that didn't cause disease, the non-pathogens. It doesn't work that way anymore because we've got so many patients who are immunocompromised. Anything will cause disease in the right host. So there's no such thing now as this group and that group. They're separate. So these bugs really are saprophytic, and because they cause disease in compromised hosts, they cause horrible diseases. They can be quite chronic, but they can also be quite acute and go from being normal, healthy, to being dead in under 3 or 4 days. And when you see them, they're quite gruesome. So there'll be a range of fungi in these groups, but the key ones will be, in the hyaline hyphomycetes, will be Aspergillus, really important, very important pathogen in compromised hosts. Scedosporium, less important, less common, but much more difficult to get rid of. Fusarium to some degree is important, and then it just trails off. And this list here in the others would be about a mile long, because there's lots of bugs in there that can occasionally cause disease. Someone will always find something in somebody and then publish it, and then it's recorded as a pathogen. But these ones cause the majority of the disease that we see. In the zygomycetes, really we've not got the skills to separate these bugs into even into their genera. All we say is this is a zygomycete based on the broad hyphae, the sporangia and the sporangiospores. But there are different species, different genera in this group, but they're really hard to separate, and we wouldn't even attempt to do that. If you're able to recognise a bug as a zygomycete, I'm happy with that. With Aspergillus in the prac, we'll speciate those. They're easy to speciate. Scedosporium should recognise that. And Fusarium, when it's growing well, is easy to recognise. So the common things about them is they're all environmental, and you'll see from your own plates, from your toes and your food, lots of us grew Penicillium, hyaline hyphomycete, Aspergillus, hyaline hyphomycete. Lots of us grew, a zygomycete of some sort. So they're common in the environment. And because of the way they make Conidia, they don't just make a few, they make truckloads of them. The spores are everywhere. And you saw how many plates in that room got contaminated with Penicillium from that first week when someone brought some food in that was full of Penicillium spores. They went just ballistic in the room, and every plate had them all over them. When they form spores, the spores for the hyaline hyphomycetes are on pediophores and shed really, really quickly in the environment. With the zygomycetes, they're in sporangial sacs, but they break away so easily that we can't find intact sporangia on our microscopy because they're always broken up, which means the spores are airborne straight away. These spores are going to be everywhere. They grow quickly, so Aspergillus and Penicillium grow to being, say, the size of a 20-cent piece. 2 days, 2 or 3 days. Zygomycetes grow and fill a whole plate in less than a week. So in under a week, if you haven't got the plate tacked down, the lid will actually come off under the growth of the organism. So they're very fast growers. And if I go that fast on a plate, they're that fast in your body. And zygomonads in particular are so aggressive. If you get one and you aren't diagnosed within the first 24 to 48 hours, it's all over. Because by the time they suss it out what's wrong with you, the bug's grown so much and it's eaten away, blood vessels and whatever else. Because they make so many spores, infection is respiratory. You breathe the spores in. And then after you breathe the spores in, it'll start off being low-grade respiratory infection. It might even be subclinical, and from there they might disseminate depending on your immune response. When you culture them, this is a really hard thing. So if I was down there right now in our micro lab and I had, say, somebody's ear swab and I grew Aspergillus, I wouldn't know whether that was from the ear swab or from the room because it's full of spores, because the room's dirty because we've all been doing our practice in there. And if you cultured, say, a toe swab and you grew Fusarium, how would you know that was from the toe infection or from your sock contamination? So we always have this dilemma. Is it from the specimen that is a real isolate, or contamination from the laboratory, or from your body? On top of that, in the third situation where sometimes these bugs colonise open body cavities. And a coloniser isn't the same as an infection. When you're colonised, the bug is in you or on you and growing, but you won't make an immune response. If it's infected, you may be subclinical and not be symptomatic, but you're making an immune response, and therefore, by definition, that's infection. The primary area that we get colonised is respiratory. And lots of times you have something wrong with you, and there'll be a big cavity somewhere in the respiratory tree that can be colonised. So you might have had a sinus infection, and they've taken part of your sinus out, and then in there behind your back of your nose is a big open cavity that's just ripe for being colonised by Aspergillus. You might have had lung disease, and you've got big open cavity in your lung from, say, from TB or from chronic asthma or airways disease or a tumour. In comes Aspergillus and grows in there like you're a plate. And I'll show you one in a minute of a chicken, and chickens get Aspergillus, and the lung is green because it's colonised with Aspergillus. Not a nice bug. For us, we're quite good at understanding whether it's contamination or this as a group, colonised infection, but we aren't good at separating this from this. Lab information can separate contamination usually from one of those, but lab information can't really separate colonisation from infection. This is done by clinical information and by maybe blood tests and looking at antibody, but it can be hard to separate. Having said that, is colonised okay or not good? Would you be okay being colonised with Aspergillus? I wouldn't be. Two reasons. The first thing is, if you're colonised, you sometimes make an allergic response, and you have an allergy to a bug that's growing in your lung. Then you get chronic runny nose, chronic congestion. You won't really infect it. It's not causing you distress from its growth. Just its metabolites, and you don't get on together, and you get this allergy. So it's not nice. And then if you're colonised and something changes, it can go from being colonisation to invasion and cause disease really, really quite quickly. So often if you're colonised, they will treat you anyway and get rid of it. But it isn't always that easy to get rid of. So let's look now at the highlight hyphomycetes. These are all septate. They're all colourless in that far bottom right-hand part of my little chart. Aspergillus, really important. There are three important species that we've got to become familiar with: Aspergillus flavus, fumigatus, and niger. And there's others as well beyond that. There's 20 or 30 more different species, but the ones we see most often in humans: flavus, fumigatus, niger. The colour of the colony is formed by the colour of the conidia, not by the hyphae. And because they form more as they get old, the colour changes as they get old. So, for example, fumigatus and flavus both start off being whitish and then light yellowish to green, and they get more and more dark green as they get older. Aspergillus niger starts off being yellow and goes to become black eventually, and the blackness is because the Cnidia are black. In the Scedosporium, the sexual name is Pseudo-Aliceria, but there's more than one Scedosporium species. There's the ones that we've seen quite a bit of, which is Scedosporium apiospermum. There's also a different one called Scedosporium prolificans, which is equally dangerous and possibly more drug resistant than Scedosporium apiospermum. These are a lot less common than Aspergillus, but because they're so resistant, once you get one of those, you really are in deep trouble. And then beyond there, a long way down in terms of frequency of disease, Fusarium can cause some disease, not common though. Pachyliomyces, similarly, not very common. And Penicillium almost never, ever causes disease, except for Penicillium monefii, the one that's dimorphic, that's now been renamed as Talaromyces monefii. You had the names, Lynn? The reason this is here is it's so important for you to recognise Penicillium and not waste your time. If you're in there and you're doing a culture of a specimen that's not sterile and you see Penicillium, what you've got to do is go like this, oh, it's Penicillium, and you throw it away. Don't waste time stuffing around with it, checking out what it is and subculturing and everything else. Otherwise, you'll be there forever. If we spend half an hour on every penicillium we grew down there in our lab, we do nothing but do penicillium for your whole career, and you never get your work done. So, got to recognise that in practice, for example, and make sure you get rid of it. So, the key thing about penicillium, to recognise it, it's like broccoli, and you've got cnidiophores, and they'll branch. There's one small branch called the metula. Now, this really is a specialised little piece of cnidiophore. You only call it a metula when it's one level down from the firelight. I hate all this terminology, it's really annoying. I'd be happy if this term didn't exist. It doesn't help you much with penicillium. Think of it as being like broccoli, and the firelight is flask-shaped. So flat at the bottom, it's thinner, and then out comes the cnidia. The key with penicillium is the cnidia form non-branching chains, and the cnidia are round. If you see those, it's penicillium. Now, on the left is a penicillium. On the right is Pachyliomyces. They're very similar. There's only one thing that's different with them. Well, probably two things. Penicillium over here, the cnidia you can't see, not very good, is it? Magnification. The cnidia there are round, and these cnidia over here are more elongated. But the key thing is, look carefully at the phyllide. So over here, the phyllides are long, so long phylides, very thin, and they bend a bit, whereas they are shorter and not bent. These are also on a colony, whitish to pink, and these are green. Not hard to separate them really. That's a terrible colour. See on my slide, it's almost blue. It's not like the colour. Can you see all those lines there? It's a corneal transplant. It's a new cornea. And the new cornea is buggered because they've been splashed in the eye with Pachyliomyces. So these fungi can cause disease, given any sort of barrier break in particular. So this person wouldn't be, compromised systemically, but locally they are because they've had an injury that penetrated the corneal surface. And the only way to cure that is to pull that whole thing out and put it in again. I have once been witness to an eye surgeon playing around with somebody's cornea. So this person had was a young kid out playing and got a splash in the eye, and he got an opaque part of his eye, and it was probably fungal. And to do a scraping of somebody's eyeball, they had to put their head in a kind of a vice thing so they couldn't move, and then scrape the eyeball, just enough to get some of the corneal stuff off there. Pretty horrible. Now, look at that. That is, I mean, it should be like this top corner. It should be see-through. That's their lens, and that is all just caused by a fusarium. So these fungi can cause disease if they've got the right opportunity. Pretty horrible. I love mycology for that. There are a whole series of cases. This is not that long ago. How many years ago would this be? Does it say that up there? I can't read it in the glasses on. 2006, so in my lifetime, in your lifetime even, 2006, 12 years ago. How would you have been then? You'd have been born, wouldn't you? And what they found here was there was contamination in lens cleaning fluid for contact lens wearers with fungal spores. You couldn't imagine anything worse than putting a solution that contains fungal spores on your eye and then adding a contact lens that every time you blink, you're pushing the spores into your eye. And they had lots of cases, a big recall of the stuff. But in the meantime, people were going blind. So there are big issues with contamination with fungal spores. I reckon it would have been, it would have been lack of cleaning. But the spores are going to be everywhere. Yes, there's no immune response in the eye. At that level there in the cornea, that's just dead skin. That's just see-through. So you really got, once it's in there, you've got no hope of just fighting off yourself. No, because how long does it last for? If you've got conjunctivitis that's on the mucous membrane, then the drops go in there and they stay under your eyelid. But if it's on the surface of your eyes are open most of the time, and there's nothing on there. Really hard to treat it. Oh, I would imagine. In fact, you know what they said? All these people that got the eye infections and went blind, they said, I'll see you in court. So penicillin, really common. That's an orange. An orange with terminal penicillin infection. It can range from being dark green to light green. Won't always be this sort of dark. They can be quite light when you grow them. So, but they're normally pretty obvious to see, and they're so powdery because they make so many conidia. That's why they look so rough. Okay, Aspergillus. Lots and lots of species, but really for humans, just those first three. The fourth one's even a lot further down in terms of frequency. So Fumigatus, Flavus, and Niger for us, really important. When you grow them, this is one example where the colony morphology is helpful. So the colour of the colony is quite helpful, but it still relies a lot on microscopy. When you look at the Aspergillus, it's the amount of the vesicle, the head of the microscopy part, the head. The amount of coverage is important. Is it all covered or the top 2/3 covered? Sometimes the length of the conidiaphore can be helpful, but most times because your microscopy won't have an intact conidiaphore from base to top, you can't measure them anyway. So that's less important. What's important though is whether they are uniseriate or biseriate. I'll explain it to you with a diagram. So here's what's called the foot cell. You hardly ever see those because on most microscopy it's all broken up and all you see is about from there upwards. If they're uniseriate, it goes from vesicle to phyllide directly with no metula, no second branch between the head and the phyllide. We call that uniseriate. If they're biseriate, there'll be a branch called the metula between the phyllide and the vesicle. Some species are uniseriate, some species are biseriate, and some species have some heads that are uniseriate and some heads that are biseriate in the same microscopy, so you've got to look around. Also what's useful is looking at the head coverage. Is it the whole thing, radial coverage, or only the top 2/3? And look also as to whether these phylides are roughly parallel to the cuneiform or they radiate outwards. Sometimes they come out and point roughly upwards, parallel to the cuneiform. And look to see whether the top of the cuneiform is smooth or rough. Claire's favourite thing to separate. It might sound hard, but seriously, for these three, it's really easy. Trust me, in the prac, you'll be able to go like that and separate these three in a snap.
So how do they look that parallel to the cuneiform?
Well, rather than being like an afro, like they look more like this. Yeah, if you just do your hair like that. Yeah, like a mohawk. Yeah, like a mohawk. So this is Aspergillus fumigatus, and it starts off being whitish, goes more blue-green. Oh, I've got the wrong button all the time. What's wrong with me? Now, fumigatus has an N in the species name, so it's smooth. Fumigatus, smooth. Okay, that's how I remember it. Works for me. So this part of the cuneiform is relatively smooth. These are uniseriate, but separating uniseriate and biseriate is quite difficult unless the head is partially nude. Because when they're fully covered, you can't see in there. So what you want to do is look around and find a head that's very immature and hasn't got hair yet, almost like a prepubescent aspergillus, if you like. And when they're still quite young, you can see the details there a lot more easily. So look around for a young one first. And the coverage here is top 2/3. It's not radiating out in all directions. This is Aspergillus niger, so much more dark in colour. And when you see the microscopy, it's really straightforward, isn't it? I mean, this is a lot different because this is total irradiate head, going in all different directions.
So was the last one, was that one the afro?
That's the afro.
And then the last one was,
That's right, that was the mohawk.
that was the mohawk, okay.
Now, this is Aspergillus flavus. Now, flavus and fumigatus are fairly similar, so they'll be harder to separate. But trust me, in the prac, you'll be able to separate them and you'll be happy. Even Claire will be happy. It'll be my task in that prac to make you happy. So this is flavus, and flavus with an L because it's a bit lumpy up here. So this is a little bit rough up there. This is a bit like the roughness you saw with the Cnidia in the Microsporum, isn't it? Yeah. On your own microscope, see on my screen here, I can see it being rough really clearly, but this is a bit too bright. Needs to turn it down. That's a little bit rough, and you will see this in the prac, I promise you. Absolutely. Cast iron guarantee you'll see that in the prac. It'll be a bit lumpy. The same kind of promise I made about marking those tests this semester. long range of disease you can see with Aspergillus. It's a very, very adaptable organism. So you'll see it a lot as a contaminant. Lots of your cultures will get Aspergillus, and it's nothing more than contamination, either from the laboratory or from the specimen, external contamination. I mean, you'll have spores of Aspergillus in your hair, in your socks, in your everywhere. They're not uncommon organisms. It can cause disease that's superficial. And the most common thing we'll see will be ear infection with Aspergillus. It's very common as a cause of otitis externa, outer ear infection. And in fact, on microscopy of a Gram stain, when you see little round things about the size of a red cell that stay in a bit gram-positivity and are a bit spiny, they're almost always chlamydia of Aspergillus, because in your ear is an open space. So they grow in your ear as it's a bit of agar, and they're growing outwards into the air space and making chlamydia. And when you do that with your ear, you have spores that will pop out. You'll be able to see the pop out of spores come out of your ear. Not that bad, really, but you can see the spores. And sometimes, seriously, the swab comes out a bit green because of the fungal stuff in your ear. It can cause keratitis. This requires some kind of trauma and implantation. But more importantly for us is the fact that it's a common respiratory organism. It can cause a whole lot of diseases. It can colonise and cause allergic disease. Some gardeners have got long-term exposure from digging in the garden around mulch and stuff like that, and they've got antibodies against Aspergillus, and they go in the garden, have a bit of a dig, breathe in the antigens, and suddenly come down with a really horrible congestion and sneeze and everything else. That's called farmer's lung. That can be really quite debilitating. Sometimes it will go, if you're immunocompromised, and form a tumour, just like a big fungus ball, but inside your lung. And that can become invasive, can go all over your body, get lung, liver, bone marrow, brain in particular. So as long as you're a cellular person, this bug can go anywhere. And when it disseminates, really quite nasty. One of the hassles with this bug is that if it's respiratory, there's a fair chance of getting it and diagnosing it. If it disseminates to your other parts of your body, you can't find it. There's no obvious signal. You can't do a blood culture and get positive. It's in there somewhere, growing as hyphae in a solid organ, and you can't get a specimen. So the big push now is to find some kind of way of diagnosing Aspergillus disease that doesn't require culture, like PCR, for example. But the trouble with PCR, it's so super sensitive, everything's positive by PCR for Aspergillus. I've even looked at finding metabolites of Aspergillus that we can't make ourselves, and looking in your blood for a metabolite that's evidence of Aspergillus metabolism inside your body. And they've not been that successful yet, but very horrible thing to see internally. And I'll show you some stats in a minute, well, a bit later on today. That's a lung, and that is all Aspergillus. This is a child with leukemia. This is post-mortem, and that's a lung, and that's all Aspergillus. Some of these are horrible. Some of them are really cool, though. This is quite possibly something like an Aspergillus, and these heads there are like primitive vesicles of the Aspergillus. And this microscopy is not from culture. This is a microscopy from a squash prep. And what happened, this is in Launceston, somebody had chronic sinusitis, always aching nose and runny nose, and they came into the laboratory, and in front of me in the front office, got a tissue and went and blew out a plug like a solid snot. And we got this into the squash prep, and that's all the hyphae. The hyphae was growing in their nose. So it wasn't so much that it was invasive, but it was just growing in an open cavity in their nose. And the reason they had this chronic congestion was A, it was blocking their nose, but the bug makes antigens, and the person had an allergy to a growing organism in their nose. That's a chicken's lung, and chickens get lots of aspergillus. That, to me, is a classic agar plate of aspergillus. The growth is there, it's all powdery and green. All of these things are ctenophores and spores on top. This is one of my all-time favourites. This would be 15 years ago. I was at a conference and the guy that I talked to afterwards gave me the slide because I asked him, I begged him for it. This was from America, and this guy was out in the garden mowing his lawn. Seriously. And the lawnmower got jammed up, and he put his hand under the lawnmower to fix it without turning it off, cut his hand off, but what he did then was he went, oh shit, I cut my hand off, this is not really I'm not happy about this. He wrapped it in a towel and went back inside and left it for a week. And then when he finally went to get attention for it, when he unwrapped the towel, it had gone mouldy. So these are moulds from the grass. Don't know. Hey? Yeah, America. Post-mortem. Brain, aspergillus, 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 aspergillus. So in the prac this coming next week, we do all our microscopy in the safety cabinet. I don't want you breathing in lots of this stuff. We're all pretty reasonable, but I don't want you doing it for that reason. The good thing is it's quite slow to develop, so if you catch it in my prac, you'll probably die next year after you've graduated and I might get in trouble for it. It's all about me, don't forget. So, where do we play a role in the laboratory? Growing aspergillus is easy. It will grow on every media. It grows on the conky agar comfortably. So if you get an ear swab and you haven't put up a SABS plate, it doesn't matter. It will grow on the blood beautifully. It will grow on the conky agar. They metabolize almost anything. So growing them is easy. The problem is proving they're significant is more difficult. It's very helpful to have positive direct microscopy. Now it's like this, and sometimes it's hard to grasp this in your head. If you have contamination from aspergillus on a plate, and that contamination is from either the lab environment or the person's specimen, contamination means there were spores on that object. A few, maybe 10, 5, it doesn't matter. Only one spore is required to give you a colony. There are a few spores there. You won't see those spores on direct microscopy. So a negative direct microscopy does not support your growth being significant. If you are infected, you actually have growth and hyphae in the specimen. So seeing hyphae on direct microscopy supports the growth being a real growth from that specimen and not just contamination. So positive direct microscopy is very supportive that what you've grown is real. Other issue you want to have is you want to have repeat positive cultures. There's no point having one positive culture from a lung biopsy and then a whole lot of negatives. You want them all to be positive and the same species, otherwise it could just indicate contamination. What you see on microscopy is septate dichotomous branching hyphae. What that means is the hyphae branch just in two directions, and normally at about 45 degrees. So classic for a hyaline hyphomycete is for the branching of the hyphae in vivo to be at 45 degrees. Septate dichotomous branching hyphae equals a hyaline hyphomycete. It might be aspergillus, it might be fusarium, it might be Pasteuromyces, but because the most common is aspergillus, we normally say, without other evidence, positive microscopy that's dichotomous and branching is probably aspergillus. Culture is easy. As I said before, though, once the bug is disseminated and is no longer focal in one particular body part, getting a specimen to culture becomes a problem. You can't just go whenever you feel like it and get a lung biopsy or a liver biopsy. It's hard to do, so you've got to find other ways to do it. So we can do tests for antibody. Not that useful because you can be antibody positive and be colonised. You can be antibody positive and had a previous infection. So antibody doesn't necessarily say you've got a current infection. You look for antigen, that's helpful sometimes. Metabolites has been helpful sometimes, but at the moment, no single test that's not culture has proven to be specific and sensitive. So it's still really hard. This to me is staggering. Crude mortality means they die, but we can't be sure they died from aspergillus because they're already sick people anyway. Well, what it's saying is 95% of those people who are diagnosed with invasive aspergillus infection die. That's pretty scary. Two reasons. The patients themselves are very sick. So if you've had a lung transplant or you're leukemic and you're neutropenic, then you're a sucker for anything. But because we diagnose them so slowly, they're already sick and they're much more sick by the time we say it's aspergillus, and by then it's too late. The drug therapy is not very good, and it's got to be done quickly to be reliable. You can't really afford to wait. So most times, if you're neutropenic and you're seen to be susceptible to a fungal infection, they'll treat you straight away and not wait for supporting evidence. If you treat them straight away and they're not got aspergillus or not got any other fungi in the same sense, the problem then is we're overusing the drugs and there's risk then of getting bugs emerging to be resistant. And you now can see aspergillus that's resistant to antifungal drugs. So it's not a good picture for aspergillus. Let me explain this slide to you. This is talking about the impact of how fast you're diagnosed. These numbers are reasonably small, but they kind of tell the right sort of story. If you're diagnosed in under 10 days from the time that you are sick, so it's 10 days from you saying, I'm sick, and they saying it's aspergillus. If it's under 10 days, the mortality is 40%. If it's more than 10 days, mortality is 90%. That's a big change in mortality based only on how fast you're diagnosed. And what's scary is, imagine having a slide where the time difference is a 10-day period. We're talking about bacteria diagnosing in 24 hours or 12 hours. We're talking about days here with aspergillus. It's slow to diagnose. So a way around that is not to look for things like microscopy and culture, but to do a CT scan. Because a CT scan will show you the lesion, which can be then recognised as being fungal and therefore probably aspergillus if it's the right kind of patient. If you do a CT scan and it's systematic, what this means is as soon as you are neutropenic and therefore in the risk category, I do these CT scans every day or every 2 days. And if I find a lesion, they treat you. So we're doing routine CT scans, mortality of 20%. If they wait until you're sick and then do a CT scan, mortality 60% and a much longer time from when you were sick to get the diagnosis. So it's all about being quick to diagnose aspergillus to be effective. As microscopy, and there's what I'm talking about. Got hooked up. There's the hyphae, and it's dichotomous branching like that. You see there, classic. You see almost where it dents in here for the sector. That's aspergillus. It could be Fusarium. It could be any of those bugs that are hyaline hyphomycetes. They have similar morphology on the hyphae. Even better there with the silver stain. Dichotomous branching hyphae. Okay, zygomycetes. Mucor, Rhizopus, Rhizomucor, and there are others in that group that are all similar. simply because they form zygospores sexually, but asexually we see broad hyphae, relatively non-septate, sporangia and sporangiospores. Sporangiophore, columella, which is the precursor where the sporangia sits. Some have a collarette and some don't. This is the sporangium and they are the sporangiospores. In some, before the columella, the sporangiophore gets a bit swollen and broadens, and we call that swollen tip before the columella, we call that an apophysis. You hardly ever see these things because most times in microscopy it's too broken up to find them. But if you're doing maybe a block prep, you might see those. You might get lucky in seeing them. If you do a teeth prep, pick the whole thing off, you might see those. But looking for these rhizoids and where they are is helpful in determining whether it's rhizopus or rhizomucor. But for us, all I want you to be able to say is this is a zygomycete. Then you're happy. So when you see on microscopy, to me they're pretty easy to recognise. You see a lot less of this, a lot more of that being exploded with lots of spores. And these spores, the sporangiospores, to me look a bit like red cells instead. They're quite roundish with a bit of a dent in them. And what I try to talk to you about in the prac is the idea that they're ribbon-like. So they tend to fold a bit on themselves and be like a little ribbon. So very, very broad and quite fragile. And there's the collarette, there's the columella, and it's broken up, and there's all the sporangiospores. Easy. This one is called Apophomyces. I don't have one of these to show you in the lab, but it's got a very, very pronounced apophysis. So it's like a wine glass almost, really swollen up there. Inside there is the columella, and it's got a small sporangium, but they're quite nice to look at if you can get one. As a disease, you'll see it referred to in the text quite often as mucormycosis. A better term is to call it zygomycosis because often it won't be mucor, it'll be rhizopus or rhizomucor. Either way, it's caused by fungi from that group. And the most common manifestation is you breathe them in. And if you're immunocompromised, particularly if you've got poorly controlled diabetes, is the worst possible case. So in poorly controlled diabetics, they'll breathe them in and they germinate in the sinuses behind your nose. And because diabetics who are poorly controlled have got really poor functioning neutrophils, it grows unchecked. And it has a real liking for growing on blood vessels and breaking them down. So the hallmark of infection is a loss of vascular function. And then the tissues are served by those blood vessels become ischemic and gangrenous, and they break down. So you see big black lesions. And it goes from being nothing to being horrible really quickly, 48 hours, 72 hours. Historically, this was really only ever about breathing them in and having rhinocerebral mucormycosis. So it involves the back of the nose and then involves the brain because it extends backwards into your skull. There's now been lots of cases of traumatic implantation following natural disasters. So there's been a lot in America following some of those big tsunamis. And they've got horrible disease that's been cutaneous by implantation as opposed to inhalation and then dissemination. Some of these aren't very nice when you look at them. This person at the moment is on the surface relatively well, but in behind the skull, in behind the eye's all swollen and it's red. When you see the CT scan in a minute, you'll just be gobsmacked by how much this is there. Check this out. So that's the eye that was not swollen. That's the eye that was swollen. And that is all fungal growth and infarction. And really, if this was you, the only way to cure that is to get surgery and cut all that out. Don't forget, the person here was immunocompromised. It wasn't just anybody who just happened to breathe a few spores in. I mean, don't forget, these spores are everywhere. We all breathe them in. If I want to try hard now to grow some Mucor, I'll just go around all of you and get a plate in your hair and get some of that out of your hair. The bugs are common. Disease is uncommon, but when you get it, it's horrible. Yeah. Got the right one. Check this out. So, to try and make these things be a little bit more realistic, I've got a few case studies that I've got from literature, and this is the kind of thing that I hope you'll sort of show in either your own presentations, this kind of stuff. This person, 50, not as though he's a really old person, 50 is pretty young really, but a diabetic, poorly controlled diabetic, bit of eye pain, got a bit of a headache, my eyes a bit sore, you know, go to the hospital, and this proptosis means the eye is actually being pushed outwards. In the end, they grew Apophomyces elegans, which is that one of those zygomycetes with the long apophysis. And even though they could get the organism, they had to cut the eye out and use amphotericin B to save the person, but it's pretty gruesome. So there's the start. His eye's a bit swollen. This is what they've cut out. That's all organism. And there's the hole where they've cut it out. And without cutting it out, you just can't treat that with antifungals and hope it's going to get better. Because by the time you get enough blood levels in the blood to be effective, it's too late. So you've got to get rid of it. This is microscopy of the biopsy. Lots of hyphae, big and broad hyphae. And there's the culture microscopy. You think that we, with the metaphytes, have all these tricks to make them form spores, so we use lactic meal, we use rice grain media, I use foil agar. Some of these zygomycetes actually don't make spores at all unless you really, really put them under stress. So one way is to use what's called agar flotation, and you get a bit of cornmeal agar, and you put the bug in that, and you float that bit of agar on some distilled water in a dish in the dark for a couple of weeks to make it form spores. Or use plain tap water agar, but you've got to make the bugs be really stressed to make them form spores. And Apophomyces, even though it's quite a nice bug to look at, it's really hard to get the bugs to do this. All you'll get normally is just lots of these hyphae about in a chlamydia. It's an example of early stage rhinocerebral mucormycosis. So I'm saying about the infarction. So in there behind this person's nose is the organism, and it's eaten away the blood vessels. No blood supply to part of the face, gangrene, infarction. Got to cut that out. If you take a tomato, just for the hell of it, and you can put some zygomyces on the tomato, it will turn into squish in about 2 or 3 days. So these bugs growing on there secrete enzymes that break down the tissue. It's doing the same thing to your face as it's doing to the tomato. You know, sometimes you see things on TV, you're never sure whether they're true. Somebody gave me this image from one of their own, well, they called it a journal. It's actually Ralph magazine that they got it from. So a really cheap boys magazine. It was a student, a boy student. It wasn't my magazine, I don't buy sort of shit, honestly. But I saw this guy on TV on one of those American shows, and that was from a zygomycete infection. Had to cut both the eyes out, so he survived, but that hole there is all from infection with a zygomycete. Now these couple here, again, were gifts from somebody else from America. Sometimes, and it's applies to a whole range of fungi, you're infected by inhalation and they disseminate, and often the first ever lesion is cutaneous, and this is a zygomycete that's come out on the skin of somebody with chronic leukemia. So they've just done a biopsy of that and grown a zygomycete. Now, if you were leukemic and you're getting skin lesions with a zygomycete, you know that zygomycete is in your body everywhere. And right now, if you were him, you'd be scared because you'd know that bug was anywhere and could do anything it wants to when it feels like it. Next one is gruesome, but just an awesome story. So, this was given at a talk I went to in Hobart, it must be at least 10, maybe 15 years ago. This guy was giving a case series on zygomycete infections. This person had open heart surgery, but was already immunocompromised anyway. I think you might have had leukemia. And the wound infected from the open heart surgery, this person's dead obviously, and it went from being heart surgery in recovery to being like this. This is less than a week. And when they cultured this, it was full of a zygomycete. And to try and work out where it came from, we did a bit of looking around and took some specimens from the environment in the theatre. And in the end, they found the spores were contaminating sticking plaster used to dress the wound. And when he went to publish the case, the company that manufactured the sticking plaster took him to court to put an embargo on the publication. And what made it more amazing was it was Elastoplast. And at the time, their slogan for advertising was Elastoplast holds, moulds to skin. In other words, holds and moulds to skin, but he was saying it holds, moulds to the skin. In the end, he published it, but he couldn't use the term, he couldn't say it was Elastoplast, but it was. And they found this fungus in lots of patients, but because this one had an open wound and was immunocompromised, he got sick. Nobody else did, but it's still caused by contamination during manufacture of a medical product. So the bugs are everywhere. This is really topical because this work was done here at UTAS, and this is a Tasmanian platypus, and they get lesions on their tails caused by a mucor. And you see a closer one, that's the lesion. Now the story of the mucor is the platypuses in Tasmania get this infection, but the ones on the mainland don't. And the theory is that the ones on the mainland have evolved with this fungus and have therefore become immune to it ultimately. The Tasmanian ones, because this fungus is not endemic to Tasmania, our platypuses are a separate lineage of evolution, haven't been exposed in their history to this fungus and suddenly have. So how did the fungus get from Queensland, where it's endemic, to Tasmania? Probably came with a green tree frog in a banana bunch. That's the theory, because these fungi are common on frogs. It's called Mucor amphibiorum. When you diagnose disease with a zygomycete, what's really important is it's got to be done quickly. Good thing is the microscopy is normally pretty easy to see because they're big and broad hyphae and they're so recognisable as nothing else that you know straight away it's a zygomycete. But culturing can be a problem because given that they're relatively non-septate, when you culture a solid piece of material from the biopsy, to culture a piece of liver, for example, or a bit of lung or something like that, you've got to mash it up before you culture it. And when you mash them up, if you mash too hard, you break the hyphae up so that none of the hyphae has got septate at either end. And that means that the hyphae is just an open tube with no walls to contain the nucleus and therefore it won't grow. So you do get plasma microscopy and negative culture quite frequently. So you just don't mash it up too hard. It may be easier to put the specimen, the bit of tissue, on the culture media directly without mashing it up. But mashing up is normally quite important because if the fungal elements are stuck inside bits of tissue and don't contact the surface of the agar, they're not going to grow either. So you've got to try and be careful how you do that. When they grow, though, they're quick. Now, what's that? Septa? What's that? Septa. So we call them non-septate, but they're really only relatively non-septate. There's not many septa, but they really are still septate. You couldn't possibly be non-septate because they have no walls and nothing to contain nucleus, they'd all be dead. So they're just more broad is the key thing, these than being non-septate. That'll be, say, 3-day growth. And the black dots there are the sporangial heads. If you've got one of those with a pair of forceps and just pluck it off and put it on a slide, that would be an intact sporangial head. Now, just let me check what this is. Oh, yeah. So, this is a person who's going to have an infection with a zygomycete, because it's in this part of the talk, so it's obviously what it's going to be. So he's had a quite nasty motorbike accident, subarachnoid hemorrhage, subdural hemorrhage, so he's obviously really, really sick. What's even more amazing is no helmet, he was drunk and on drugs. So he was kind of asking for it. Day 4, grows an E. coli. So growing an E. coli from a wound doesn't mean much really, does it? I mean, you've got a neck wound from or a head wound, and you go E. coli. Does that really bother you? Not really. Surely only coloniser. But he also grew lots of colonies. So there's an example where you've done a culture for bacterial culture, and you've grown the fungus just because you're lucky. So there's a plain blood plate full of white fluffy colony, but no spores. And some journals that you read are for a different audience, and this journal was for an audience that was surgeons. So they called the hyphae dermatiaceous. It should be dematiaceous, not dermatiaceous. And even then, the hyphae was not brown. So if it's a micro journal, it'll be more accurate for microbiology. This is a journal for surgery. So this was a mistake in the paper. But they saw lots of hyphae on microscopy of the biopsy. And this is what it's done. So this is the person's head up there. This is all the top part of the chest. And that's the ear up there. This is all part of the neck. All that is debridement to remove all the tissue because you can't treat the bug with antifungals. It's too slow. You've got to get the bug's too fast a grower for these drugs to be effective. It's all to be surgery. And there's their Pappomyces. So 15% of the body surface was debrided just from a lovely little fungus in the environment. Talk now about Scedosporium. Now, you can't remember everything, but Scedosporium is a really important organism because it's not that common, but when you get it, it's really quite nasty because it's so resistant to antifungal drugs. So for us, we're talking about it being a cause of pulmonary disease primarily, and it goes from the respiratory tract and will disseminate. We'll see this a lot in CF patients, cystic fibrosis patients who get colonised early in their life. Lung transplants, really anyone who's got severe neutropenia is at risk. Double risk if you've got airways disease as well as being neutropenic. At the moment, you know, we're working hard on finding new drugs. So we've got lots of azole drugs. Some of the new ones that are coming out are called caspofungins and echinocandidins, So the two newer drug classes are quite experimental, but they haven't been used quite a bit to treat Scedosporium. When you see them, they're just white fungi with a bit of grey to them. Nothing at all spectacular. Their microscopy, we've seen this in the pack already. This is Scedosporium apiospermum, long, finished cnidophore, single cnidia, sometimes being born at the tip, sometimes being born laterally off the cnidiophore. So I hope if you saw that, it's reasonably typical. If you see Scedosporium prolificans is a different species, the key with this one is you form chains of cnidia, but the phyllide here, that's what we call it an annelide, but for us we call it a phyllide. It's the same thing apart from one small difference. I'll call it a phyllide. It's swollen at the base, so rather than being just a 10-pin bowling pin, it's got a swollen base, thin, swollen, and then swollen and thin again. It's quite a funny shape there before the chain of cnidia. That there is the phyllide. That's the phyllide, there's the chains. That and that is the phyllide, then the chains. So it's reasonably typical. You wouldn't confuse that with penicillium because there's no, the chains aren't long enough. And with penicillium, there's the brushes like this, these are the singles. And again on a colony, it's a big grey colony. Seen that before, just jump over that for a second. Now, this was a case the students presented in their case studies a couple of years ago. Imagine you're working on a farm that uses pig sewage to make methane to use for the farm for power. And you fall in the vat of pig feces and you almost drown. But you don't drown and you survive. So you think, I'm so lucky I've survived not being drowned in pig shit. 2 days after, 2 weeks after rather, fever and headache, get a CT scan, they see an abscess in the brain. I can't work out why he was discharged. I mean, if I had a brain abscess on a CT scan, I wouldn't be saying, yeah, I want to go home, would you? I'd be saying, I want to stay where I am, thanks. So you see now, cefotaxime, metronidazole, and fluconazole. This to cover fungi, this to cover what? Anaerobes, because they're common causes of abscesses. Cefotaxime covers everything else. Covers most gram negatives, covers some gram positives to a degree. But obviously at this point here, they've got no idea what it is because they've covered everything. So it's come back up in 2 more weeks. CSF, highly inflamed, high white cell count. Now, mannitol and dexamethasone are all drugs to make you stop fitting if you're fitting. They've now added vancomycin and rifampicin. What are they there for? Vancomycin, gram positives. Rifampicin, gram positives. Still cefotaxime, also carbazepine for anti-fits. More seizures. And at this point, they've twigged because of the way it's presented that it might be a Scedosporium. So at this point there, it's been like 4 weeks post the accident. And if you add amphotericin B and itraconazole, that's it. That's the end of the line for the good drugs that are antifungals. Still more negatives. Finally grew Scedosporium, but he still died. Scedosporium is one of those bugs which like to live in stagnant, dirty water, aquatic sources. So any near drowning, Scedosporium is what you classically think of. So not a nice bug. We talk now in general about all kinds of fungi. So we've moved on now from just looking at those zygomycetes and the hyphomycetes. Look now at fungi as a cause of hospital-acquired infections. So a whole separate thought process now. When do fungi cause disease in hospitalised patients? Not cause the disease out of hospital and you're sick, you go to hospital. It's saying you're already in there for something else and your infection is nosocomially acquired and it's fungal. The most common nosocomial infecting organism is in general for all diseases of nosocomial. E. coli, by a mile. E. coli by a mile. Enterococci, Staph aureus, Pseudomonas, probably those top four. And then below that is probably Candida albicans. So we are seeing now an explosion in the number of people who are infected with fungi while they're in hospital. And really it's quite clear what's happening is we're getting better and better and better at keeping people alive longer and longer that are severely immunocompromised, especially neutropenic. Neutropenia equals fungi. It's really that simple. And quite often they're getting in via catheters or getting in by other barrier breaks, plus inhalation. So depending on the survey you look at, Candida albicans is either the fourth or seventh most common pathogen that's nosocomial. That's a long up the list. It's only behind E. coli, Staph, Pseudomonas, and Enterococcus. It's not bad for a yeast. What's scary though is that every single person has this organism in their bowel. And most often Candida that disseminates is your own Candida. It's not cross-infection, it's your own. On top of Candida albicans, other yeasts, Candida auris has become really, really important. I hate the term superbug because I think to me it implies the bug's something special. It's not really, it's just that we're getting more and more prone to infection and these are harder to treat, but this bug is no more aggressive, probably less aggressive than Candida albicans. Once you have it, it's hard to get rid of. You find these other Candidas also cause disease, and then below the Candidas would be Aspergillus. So really for hospital-acquired infection, think Candida, particularly albicans, and think Aspergillus. The epidemiology is kind of like this. Endogenous is the most common. It's most common for it to be Candida albicans. It's most common to be your own Candida albicans. If they're moulds, then moulds, it's normally they're exogenous. There's no normal mould flora on your body, so it's got to come from somewhere external. And one of the reasons why you can't take flowers and plants into, say, ICU or leukemic wards is the flowers in the soil contain spores of fungi that might be dangerous. We also find that lots of wards where people are severely immunocompromised have filtration where the air that goes into the room is filtered. So none of this just coming out of the air like this with vents. It will all be filtered to minimise fungal spores being sent through the room. And when the filters fail, there's increased risk. You also know there's been lots of cases where there's been building works going on in hospitals, and when you start knocking down walls, you release lots of dust, and the dust contains spores of fungi, and there's been lots of extra infection. So now they try and wall off the wards from any dust contamination from construction sites on the hospital. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do remember that. But I don't know if they fix it or not. But I know there's been so many cases where construction, and all of a sudden within a month, a big spike of infection, and it's all respiratory, and it's all Aspergillus, Scedosporians, Fusarians. There's not much cross-infection, so most times it's the reason why you don't get cross-infection. Cross-infection is when the bug's the most important thing. Dangerous bug on you, I transfer this from this patient to this patient, now you're infected. With fungi, the most important thing is the person, they're immunocompromised. So unless you transfer a bug from the right kind of patient to another patient of the same type, there'll be no cross-infection. So we don't get much cross-infection. We do, though, get contamination of a number of medical devices and solutions. A number of things that we give to people as injections can have contamination with fungal spores, and you see lots of issues with that. So think about this. If you die having had prolonged neutropenia, so you've got leukemia, you've had a transplant, you're neutropenic, and then you die. 1/3 of those people that die have a fungal disease diagnosed at post-mortem that wasn't recognised before they died. That means there's lots of fungal infections that go unrecognised and kill people because we have got the tools to recognise the disease. You can be febrile. We know you're infected. We can't find what the cause is until you're dead, and we cut you open, have a look, and find a lesion. So these days, imaging has become the real tool. CT scan, CT scan, CT scan, but they're expensive, and if you can't do them all the time, everybody. And these things, there might be one CT scan in a big hospital, and the queue to use the machine is a pretty big queue. So you can't be doing these things all the time if you're neutropenic. If you have an infection that's nosocomial, there's double the mortality if it's fungal compared to if it's bacterial. So if you have a choice and you're in hospital and you get an infection, put your hand up for Staph aureus or E. coli. You don't want Candida or Aspergillus because it's much worse. This is reasonably old sort of data, but the reason I'm putting it in is it's nice sometimes to see Australian context what we're talking about. This is a survey by Monica Slaven from the mainland. She's a mycologist, well, she's an infectious disease physician, but she's a mycologist specialist. And she's looking there at the burden of disease from Aspergillus and Candida in Australian hospitals. So over that 4-year period, it's quite a long time ago, but there's still 5,000 deaths caused by either Aspergillus or by Candida. That's a lot of cases, a lot of deaths. And the number of cases of just candidiasis is massive. So right now, in Australia in particular, fungal disease, hospitalised patients is a big issue, and we're not doing it very well. And same here with Scedosporium. Not many cases, fairly small numbers there, but we're looking at every single case being 2 more weeks in hospital, length of stay extended, and every day is worth at least $1,000, often double that in hospital costs. So lots of disease and health burden from fungi. The very, very last thing before we have a bit of a break is the idea of the sick building syndrome. Now, when I was here as a student, my lecturer had a bit of a thing about this, and what he did was he took some blood from people in his laboratory before he came here, and then went to the air vents and got a whole pile of shit from up there in the air vents. If you go up there with your finger and run your finger in there, it comes out black, and the dust is all full of fungal spores. And what he did was got the serum of these people, got an agar plate, and put their serum in the agar in a little well, and then over there a second well, and you put an extract of all that material. And when the serum antibodies diffuse towards the stuff in the well, they precipitate, called an immunodiffusion test. What that's showing was that people who worked in a certain building had antibodies to stuff in the air that was coming out. And the whole thing about sick building syndrome is you're most sick on Monday and Tuesday and less sick the rest of the week. And what happens is you've got these long-standing antibodies to fungal antigens in the air vents. You go home, you have a whole weekend away from them, and you come back and you're hypersensitive. You sit and walk in the building, you breathe them in, allergic response from IgE, and suddenly it's hay fever. So sick building syndrome is the idea that fungal spores in the building can cause health effects that aren't so debilitating, but they're really uncomfortable. And in a minute, I'll show you some of these things. Now, a couple of years ago, as part of the prac, what we did, I gave all the students an agar plate to take home with them for mycology. I said, take this agar plate home with you and put it somewhere in your house with the lid off for a couple of days, and then bring it back in and we'll see what you've grown from the air around your place. And one student brought this plate in, and I swear the plate was completely green. Nothing else was there at all. And when I said, where do you put the plate, she said, it's under my bed. And her bed, she had a water bed, and the bed had leaked, had a chronic leak. So under her bed was always sopping wet. And the carpet had rotted so much that the whole bedroom was just full of spores. What's that? Yeah, okay, I don't think it. I mean, they're students after all. You go in your home, around your windowsills. When the windows get damp on the wood around your windowsills, often it's a bit black. If you just do that with your finger, that would be fungal stuff. And I used to get really bad hay fever in the winter from spores from windows in that old house. So this is quite nasty. There you go. That's under somebody's desk in a warm climate, and the wood under the desk is a bit moist. Fungi on the wood grow, and he'd come in to work in the morning under his desk, bang it with his knees, spores would come out, start sneezing straight away. So fungi can do more than just infect you, they can cause chronic disease. Now, this stuff here is not examinable. So if you want to have a sleep, for the next, is it one more slide? Yeah, that's one slide. Honestly, this is the coolest thing. The guy that wrote this is called Arturo Casadevall. I think he's a Spanish bloke, but he's absolutely brilliant. He lives in New York, and his whole area of research is looking at fungal disease and why fungi cause disease in some people and not others. And what he's really saying is that fungi cause a lot more disease in cold-blooded animals than in mammals. So they cause horrible disease in frogs, other reptiles, and in plants, but not in humans. And he worked out, by various different calculations, that most fungi can grow quite well in a cold temperature, and every degree above 30 degrees that you raise your body temperature, you exclude about 6% of all known fungi from growing in your body. So the warmer you are, the less disease you can get from fungi. And the colder you are, the more prone you are to infection from one of those 1.5 million fungi that exist that currently don't cause disease. So us being warm is helpful. So then he went and did a calculation, and he worked out the cost of being warm, because being warm is costly for an animal to make all this body temperature to keep yourself warm. And he worked out, doing a graph that said, as you get hotter, what's the trade-off between the cost to you metabolically to be warm and the benefit from avoiding fungi? He did a graph, and he's basically saying that as you get hotter and hotter and hotter, you get more and more fit in terms of avoiding fungal infection. But at some point, when you get too hot, the cost of being this hot means you end up being less fit than you were before. And did all this totally blind. And then did the curve and looks at the optimum temperature to be to avoid being killed by fungi is 37. Now, his biggest thing now is saying that if we've got global warming, the fungi in the environment will therefore become selected to grow in warmer and warmer animals. So maybe in the next decade or so, we might have more and more fungi that can cause disease in humans that couldn't do before. Think back to Pterococcus neoformans in British Columbia. They've suddenly gone from being not a problem to being a big problem only because of global warming. That's their theory. So the issue may be that, especially Basidiomycetes, which is what that bug is, Pterococcus neoformans, maybe the risk there is that as we get warmer and warmer and warmer, we're at more risk. So watch that space. If you want to read this guy, he's got 3 or 4 papers out that are written in fairly easy terminology to read, but it's really quite a cool guy to read. It's very good. Have a break. When we come back, we'll do a quick review of the last few weeks, very quick review. I'll point out key things for the testing that I want you to be familiar with, and then at this time we'll look at the video if we can get it to work. Okay? So come back, say, in 10 minutes. And I'll pause. All right, last part. I can't play the video, so we just have to go and do something else. The key thing is what you think about for the test. So make sure you're okay with some of the nomenclature for fungal microscopy. Know what a phyllite is. Know what the cnidaria look like if we describe them by shape. If we say piriform, what does that mean? If we say truncate, what does that mean? What's the common structure of common fungi? So could you draw me, for example, Aspergillus or Penicillium or a Zygomycete? Some of the common fungi. For the overall nomenclature of fungi, the scheme that I've tried to use for you to understand where they fit in the scheme of things is there's yeast and there's mould and there's dimorphics. Understand that yeast are single-celled and they behave more like bacteria in terms of their microscopy is not very specific. They're just roundish or oval-shaped cells. Sometimes you can see some differences. So, for example, Candida albicans is normally oval-shaped. If I see a yeast that's not oval with little buds, if it's too long with bits of hyphae, my first thought is it's not Candida albicans. If it's too round, it's not Candida albicans. Really, for most routine laboratories, it's all about Candida albicans and then the rest. Certainly from a non-sterile site, we're thinking about Candida albicans mostly. So for all of the yeast, I spend quite a bit of time, if I was you, thinking about Candida albicans and to some degree Tropicalis and what role we play in recognising them. So the whole Chrome-Agar thing, it's a really, really useful medium. It's used a lot in routine laboratories because it's good at picking up the most common yeast from non-critical sites. Chrome-Agar is fine if it's a skin swab or a vagina swab because it would pick up Candida albicans or Tropicalis and then the rest. You can't use that for a sterile site or even chronic recurrent disease because that's when you want to know much more about the organism and you do multi-top or some kind of biochem panel that proves what it is exactly. I mean, if we all get to the point where we do PCR on every Candida albicans from a vagina swab, we'd all go broke. It's horses for courses. Choose the right technique, the right degree of specificity for your technique for the situation. And vagina swabs where you get Candida 10 times a day, it's not the time to be going playing expert with PCR or whatever you want to do. With C. formans, just have a rough idea that the bug's quite variable. So there's Bacillosporus gattii and the C. formans itself. They cause very similar diseases. They're very similar on microscopy. The only difference is by serotyping them, you can go into A, B, C or D, or you do the CGB agar, which separates Bacillosporus, the old gattii, from the others. And that can be important purely because they tend to cause a bit of a different disease. But really, for therapy, there's no difference in how you treat Bacillosporus gattii versus plain Neoformans. So it wouldn't matter if you didn't get it right, but it helps to know a bit about the disease manifestation in terms of how you monitor the patient and how you work out where it came from. So, of all the yeasts, Candida albicans, Tropicalis, and then C. formans, they're important. Beyond that, really, you've heard the word Candida auris. What does it mean for us? I don't know. It's not a very common organism. It's been found once in Australia, so it's not as though it's rampant, but it is getting a lot of press, so you've got to be aware of it. If you've not heard of the name before, then it would be pretty bad if you've not heard of it. But we don't do a lot with it because we've not got one here yet. With the dimorphic fungi, they all really have a lot of common features about them. And I wouldn't ask you to memorise the microscopy of the yeast and mould phase for all of them. It's too hard. I can't even do it myself, never even tried. What I would say, though, is that out of all of those, there are a couple that are worth extra attention. The first one is Coccidioides immitis, purely because it's the one that's most commonly seen as a risk to laboratory personnel. White puffy mould, lots of arthrospores, breathe them in, very dangerous. So that to me gets more attention than the others like Blastomyces, for example. And the other one is Tallaromyces monifii. Two reasons why that's important to have some more attention to. First thing is, it appears to be the same on microscopy as penicillium. I would hate you to be in a lab somewhere, get a sterile site with Tallaromyces, really important organism, and go, oh, it's penicillium, and chuck it out. So be aware that penicilliums from sterile sites, your first thought is, make sure it's not Tallaromyces monifii. And the way you do that is looking at the patient's history and what their immune status was. It won't cause disease in someone who's immunocompetent. And it's normally seen in patients who've either visited or come from Southeast Asia. On culture, it's got a very, very distinct orange to red pigment that will diffuse into the agar. So those are the two that I'd spend more time on. Don't get all hung up on this sexual reproduction business with fungi. To me, it's one of those things that's a real irritation because I still don't understand myself where it fits in the scheme of things for laboratory work. In the end, most often it doesn't, except that it creates this confusion over what name to use for some organisms. We never see fungi in the sexual state in a human specimen, apart from occasionally Scedosporium can form these great big ascospores, but most times they're there by themselves and therefore they're reproducing asexually. It's not an issue for us, but be aware the names can be different. For the mycoses that are superficial, there's lots of them, they're quite obscure. For us, what's really important is be aware of Taenia versicolor because it's quite a common infection and it's diagnosed a lot in laboratory, so be aware of what the microscopy should look like. For the rest, I won't get too worried about them. Think about onychomycosis because onychomycosis is one of those infections that straddles being superficial and being also cutaneous with dermatophytes. So for onychomycosis, it might be by dermatophyte, it might be by acromonium or Scopiaropsis or Fusarium or Candida or dermatophytes. For the dermatophytes, as long as you've done the assignment, you should know all you have to know about dermatophytes. It's not as though it's that difficult. All I want you to do is be familiar with the common 5 dermatophytes. There's no point knowing all of them to a tiny degree. That's just useless. You're better off knowing the common 5 ones pretty well, and then that means that most of your working time is on those 5 anyway. So T. menta, T. rubrum, Equilocosum, M. canis, M. gypsum, and have a rough idea of the others that exist, but don't spend time memorising all of those. There's no point. Make sure you get the idea that they grow slowly, so you've got to have media that's selective, otherwise they're overgrown by saprophytes. Have a rough idea of their microscopy and how they appear in culture. All the ones are systemic, subcutaneous. Think about the way the disease presents. If it's nodules that spread on lymph drainage channels, then that will be Sporophylix schenkii. It's a unique disease with a unique presentation. If it's subcutaneous and you're seeing lesions that are like little tumours, are external swellings, then it's most likely a case of chromoblastomycosis. That can be a whole range of fungal adermatiosis, and the key thing there is how the body and the fungus interact, and do they form sclerotic bodies, which are kind of like a strange dimorphic thing. We can't culture them as yeasts in the lab, but in the body they're actually growing as some kind of pseudo-yeast type organism, and the way that the body and that yeast type bug interact causes those lesions that are quite typical. And it could be any fungus that puts dermatiosis, most commonly Exophiala and Planosporium and Fonseca, but there's more than that. The key thing with those is their dermatiosis, and they're slow growers. It's a chronic disease. With Mycetoma, get the idea that it can be eumycotic, or it can be caused by bacteria, actinomycotic, so the branching gram-positive rods. Other than that, they appear to be the same kind of disease clinically anyway. It's not until we culture them that we get the idea of which one it is. We've already covered this pretty well. we're okay with the yeast pretty well. High-lung hyphomycetes, talking really going to be about Aspergillus, 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 and then a bit of Ascetosporum, but it's really about Aspergillus. And the zygomycetes, broad hyphae, sporangiospores and sporangia, most commonly inhalation, sometimes traumatic implantation. What I'll do is I'm going to write the test probably today or tomorrow. I will email you more with a rough idea of not what's in the test, but the format of the test. At the moment, it's going to be, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 questions that you write a little bit of stuff. I'm just thinking about making half of it be the multiple choice or one-word answer ones. Just try and broaden it. But I'll let you know the format for the test. And that'll be next week. So, between now and next week, what's going to be handed in? When's the mycology thing due in? It would make sense to do that before you have the test, probably. It probably won't hurt you if not done by then. Make sure that your case study, you haven't let you know yet of a topic, you've got to do it this week, otherwise we're running out of time. Apart from that, I think we're all done, apart from the prac next week. Any other dramas? No one's worried about anything else? All good? Okay. See you next week for the pracs. Yeah. Yeah. What's in it? Yeah. 10 or 11. So here they're asleep in. I can't get to work. It's on fungi. If you want to go and find a DVD player and watch it, you can. You can just borrow my DVD. There's no DVD drive on it. See, all the new ones are all solid state. I've only got a chip in there. There's no DVD drive. What's that? You don't hear got a laptop with a DVD drive? Never mind.